The Final Fantasy VII Remake is an odd game. Cloud performs an unpracticed but somehow synchronized dance with a total stranger. Cloud can have a squatting competition against a few incredibly nice gym bros, followed by Tifa having a pull-up competition with said gym bros. No matter what the Final Fantasy VII Remake tells me, I'm pretty sure that you cannot actually do 300 pull-ups in one afternoon and be good to punch bad guys again right afterwards. Cloud and Aerith fight in gladiator combat against a house? This isn't even touching on whatever the heck is going on here. Scarlet, is that your partner? Your assistant? Is there a Shinra position that reads apply here to become Scarlet's footstool? Look, I don't want to kink shame. I just really want to understand whatever this situation is, and I'm really hoping it's consensual. And yet, okay, look, I don't think the FF7 remake is going to be regarded as the Citizen Kane of video games, and I don't think it should be. But now that I've finished it and delved more deeply into the larger Final Fantasy VII lore, I think it's actually a very good, very poignant game. Yes, it has some extremely goofy trappings, which for the record, I absolutely love. In fact, in my book, they could have gone even goofier. From nearly the moment I stepped foot in Wall Market, I lamented the fact that I was unable to procure a cowboy hat for Cloud. In many ways, the FF7 remake is a mess of contradictions. At the least, the tone can be all over the place. But perhaps despite itself at times, it is a deeply emotional game. And I want to talk about that. On first glance, it might seem like the three categories I've listed in this video title are unconnected, but trust me here, I have the four-dimensional chessboard set up in my mind. We will circle around all three of these topics and back by the end. So on to our first topic. Part 1. The male gaze. In 1975, British film theorist Laura Mulvey published an essay entitled Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. In this essay, Mulvey puts forward that one of the pleasures of cinema is the act of looking. However, she also notes that, in a world ordered by sexual imbalance, the pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so that they can be said to connote to be looked atness. In other words, Mulvey says that in film, the difference in societal power between men and women manifests in a phenomenon where women are portrayed as objects to be looked at for male pleasure, or more accurately, for heterosexual male pleasure. This means that cinema often looks at women through a quote-unquote male gaze. As Janice Lorick notes in an article for The Conversation, this means that for a woman viewed under the male gaze, her feelings, thoughts, and her own sexual drives are less important than her being framed by male desire. A frequently used example of the male gaze is the way that Megan Fox's character Michaela is portrayed in Transformers. As Lindsay Ellis points out in her video series on the Transformers movies, Michaela is written as an intelligent, well-rounded character with mechanical skills that make her invaluable to the plot of the film. Yet the film visually frames her as nothing more than an object of male desire. Of course, Michaela is far from the only example. From basically all of the Bond girls to Black Widow's introduction in the Marvel Cinematic Universe,
I want one.
No.
to 7 of 9 in Star Trek Voyager, TV and film have traditionally remained under the purview of the male gaze. And of course, the male gaze extends beyond cinema. The male gaze can be found in visual art, in comic books and graphic novels, even in non-visual media such as books. And if you don't believe me about the last one, then just look up basically any description of a woman in one of Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden series. Molly was tall and built like a pin-up model, with long, long legs and curves that not even the layers of clothing could hide. I don't know what this voice is. Her face was lovely and devoid of makeup, and her cheekbones pressed out harshly against her skin. Keep in mind that Molly is homeless at this point. Harry hasn't seen her in a long time, and this is how he chooses to start out describing her. Add to that the fact that Harry has known Molly since she was a literal child, and this is possibly the least creepy description of her that he's ever given, including in the same book that I took this quote from. The male gaze is also present in video games. You probably know where I'm going with this, including both the original Final Fantasy VII and perhaps even more so in the remake due to its much higher resolutionness. Nearly all of the female characters show significant amounts of cleavage, midriff, and/or legs. This is most obvious in Tifa's character design, even more so if she ends up with the mature dress option for the wall market section of the game. And that's even taking into account the fact that the size of her breasts were decreased to give her character more of an athletic feel, to the chagrin of gamers everywhere. But these comments also apply to Yuffie, Kyrie, and Scarlet. Jessie is fully clothed, but inexplicably given form-fitting boob armor. And before you say, but North, she has boobs, she needs the boob armor, I just want to say that's not how armor works. Genova is an alien, but also a naked woman. It's good to know that aliens are so well endowed. Even Madame M, who is mostly fully clothed, has a plunging neckline and a sleeve that she refuses to pull up her shoulder. This doesn't drive me crazy at all. The main characters who don't really have sexualized character designs are the mom characters, for I think obvious reasons, and Aerith for the most part, though she does still have a pretty low neckline, and if you unlock Aerith's ultimate dress in the wall market scene, she has an even lower neckline and shows plenty of leg. By contrast, most of the male characters are fully clothed, or mostly fully clothed. Cloud, Biggs, Wedge, Roche, Brood, Sung, Chocobo Sam, Heidegger, President Shinra, Reeves, Rufus, they're all covered. Sephiroth has a little bit of pecs peeking through, and so does Barrett, but otherwise they too are fully clothed. Sure, Cloud's sweater is a bit tight, but if you compare his tight sweater to Tifa's everything, there's really no comparison in terms of sexualization. And at this point you might be saying, but North, Johnny doesn't have a shirt. Reno has a deep V. What about Andrea's outfit? To that I say, well, I'll give you Andrea for reasons that I'll get into in a minute, but here's the tricky thing about the male gaze. In her essay, Laura Mulvey says the following about the male gaze being turned to other men. The man controls the film fantasy and also emerges as the representative of power in a further sense, as the bearer of the look of the spectator, transferring it behind the screen to neutralize the extra diegetic tendencies represented by woman as spectacle. This is made possible through the processes set in motion by structuring the film around a main controlling figure with whom the spectator can identify. A male movie star's glamorous characteristics are thus not those of the erotic object of the gaze, but those of the more perfect, more complete, more powerful ideal ego conceived in the original moment of recognition in front of the mirror. The character in the story can make things happen and control events better than the subject/spectator. In other words, when men are portrayed under the male gaze, they are often presented as quote-unquote ideal men, men that other men wish to be, that they fantasize about being. In their article Negotiating Masculinity's Advertising and the Inversion of the Male Gaze, Maurice Patterson and Richard Elliott note the following about this type of narcissistic identification with the ideal man in, for example, advertising. It allows the male spectator to retain a sense of power and control, for through such identification the spectator is able to integrate the desirable meanings or values assigned to the bodies and transferred to the consumer goods being depicted. Thus, through such self-extension practices, the spectator incorporates hypermasculine ideals into his own identity that invariably serve to support his patriarchal power. In this sense, even our shirtless male characters are also portrayed under the male gaze. These are attractive, well-toned men, one could even say physically ideal men. And frankly, this analysis extends to most of the other male character models. Just look at the size of Barrett's biceps. But our female character models, by contrast, don't have the same sort of very apparent muscle tone. I suppose if you look closely, you can see Tifa's abs. Somehow I don't think that's the first thing you'd notice about Tifa, but they are there. As a whole, though, the female character models have unrealistically small waists and muscles softened by curves. There is only one plus-sized main character, Wedge, and he's frequently framed as someone to be taken less seriously if for no other reason than he is often injured. And it's not just about the character models, it's also about how the characters are framed within the game itself. Look at this cutscene of Tifa.
I'm really glad to have you back, Cloud. Really glad. It's pretty late, huh? I'd like to catch up more, but we should probably both get some sleep, yeah?
Yeah.
Good night, then.
Or this cutscene of Aerith. And now compare those to this cutscene of Reno, one of our partially shirtless male characters.
I'll see myself in. Thanks. And who are you?
He's my bodyguard. And a soldier. Pretty cool, huh?
Huh? A soldier?
Ex-soldier.
Well, what do you know? You've got the eyes, at least.
This is about as sexualized as he gets, but note that the camera doesn't linger on him the way that it lingers on Tifa or Aerith. The framing objectifies them in a way that it doesn't objectify him. Not only that, the low-angle shots that often frame Reno place him in a position of visual power, and these initial cutscenes of Reno highlight his fighting abilities, and in my opinion make him look like an even better fighter than he actually is in the game. To further hone in on this point, let me show you this scene from Don't Trust the Bee in Apartment 23, which is one of the best instances of a woman objectifying a man's body that I'm personally aware of.
Nope. Nobody. Soy latte guy. He comes in every day, orders a soy latte, and I can see his abs through his t-shirt.
This sort of framing doesn't really happen to men in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, at least not with the frequency that it happens to women. That isn't to say that I didn't try my darndest to bring objectification of men into the game while playing it. So here's the thing, his biceps, those are some very
Looks are what people notice first.
toned biceps. I'm missing the conversation because I'm looking at his biceps.
You're not even reading the same book.
Enough. We're done here.
Or even the same.
But his hips are so tiny. He has such tiny little hips. I was saying earlier that he has the proportions of a Disney princess. Like, his waist is approximately the same size as his head.
Sure, there's lots of secrets I don't know.
He just Cloud with his tiny little girl hips. He has the build of a teenage girl, except with larger biceps. I love it. It's so weird. And it's not helped by the fact that he has very baggy pants, which just accentuates how tiny his little waist is. I've been saying, from literally the first time I played this game, you had the hips of a teenage girl, and lo and behold, you've proven it to us with how that dress fits you. His hips are so small. Think too, like, so just look at Cloud's thigh gap, right? Like, he has a massive thigh gap, which means that he has very skinny legs. I just say this from, like, a purely, like, scholarly standpoint. I want to see what his character model looks like without pants. I'm so sorry, Cloud. You don't deserve this. I've undermined all of my points! In fact, as fate would have it, while I was working on editing this video essay, I received an email from Square Enix informing me that I can pre-order these figurines of Tifa and Aerith in their most fan-servicey wall market dresses, and I And honestly, it's not even the fact that Square Enix is selling these extremely overpriced figurines of Tifa and Aerith dressed in their sexiest finery. It's the fact that both of them are hunched over like they're ultra-rare waifus from a gacha game. By pure accident, when I played through the FF7 Remake, I managed to get both of these dresses, and look how cute they are beating up thugs and high-fiving afterwards. But here, my lower back hurts just from looking at them. Who stands like this? Nobody. Nobody with any concern for their lower back, at least. Now granted, there is one way in which I would begrudgingly approve these figurines, and that is if they were also selling one of Cloud dressed in his best wall market finery and also hunched over in this sexy girl pose. Alas, my need to objectify Cloud and his tiny hips remains unfulfilled. And to be clear, I don't necessarily think there is something wrong with having sexualized female character designs, especially when it naturally fits into the character's personality. Scarlett's outfit, for example, would probably be unacceptable in most work environments, but then again, so would using a human as a footstool. Again, so many questions. So it kind of makes sense. Plenty of women, even straight women, enjoy playing games with sexualized female characters. I don't want to see people accuse me in the comments of thinking that women need to dress like they're, I don't know, pioneer wives or something, when that's not what I'm saying. The problem arises when almost all of the character designs for the female characters are sexualized, and almost all of the character designs for the male characters are not sexualized, especially when taken in the larger context of video games as a whole, where this happens again and again and again. Things that are not an issue in isolation can absolutely become an issue when they are repeated systemically. The same goes for having most of your characters be male, which is also true in Final Fantasy VII. Additionally, also to be clear, there is nothing inherently wrong with the male gaze. Telling stories from a male perspective is perfectly fine. In fact, framing a story under the male gaze can even be used in interesting ways to examine tropes that male storytelling can fall into. For example, 500 Days of Summer is a movie told exclusively from the perspective of its male main character, and uses that framing to explore how he views Summer as a person. But a problem occurs when the framing of the male gaze is so widespread through media that it becomes a default language. When it predominates the types of stories that are told and how they are told, and especially when the male gaze is presented as being objective storytelling when, for the reasons I've discussed, the male gaze is inherently not objective. The question then perhaps is, okay, the FF7 Remake features the male gaze, you're not breaking any ground here, North. What about the female gaze? What even is the female gaze? And that is a very good question. Tori Telfer wrote an article for Vulture cataloging a number of comments that female cinematographers have said about the quote-unquote female gaze. Several women note that the difference in their approach to cinematography is to respect the relationships occurring between the actors in the scene as opposed to inserting themselves into it. Other women comment that they do not believe in a female gaze because they prefer not to think of cinematography along a gender binary, while another woman states that the female gaze does not exist because, unlike the male gaze, the female gaze never had time to coalesce into a visual language. In essence, even the professionals don't agree on what a female gaze is or if it even exists. In an article entitled, "Yes, There's Such a Thing as a Female Gaze, but It's Not What You Think," Stephanie Forster says the following about a female gaze. If the male gaze objectifies women, then the female gaze must be the mirror opposite, right? Bring on the close-ups of rippling pecs and washboard abs. We're finally free to objectify man parts with wild, feminist abandon. Not quite. The answer is a bit more complicated. The female gaze isn't about asserting female dominance on screen, and it doesn't mean that we therefore get to manjectify men in reverse. That's because the male gaze isn't just about objectifying women. A male perspective doesn't have to mean women are objectified, even though the majority of the time this is true. It's a way to explain a limited male view, where the rest of the characters exist mainly to serve him, his interests, and his storyline. In 2016, Transparent and I Love Dick creator Joey Soloway spoke about the challenge of defining the female gaze at the Toronto International Film Festival. They argued that the female gaze is really about using the presence of a female perspective on screen to emphasize the story's emotions and characters. If the male gaze is all about what men see, then the female gaze is about making the audience feel what women see and experience. Forster goes on to give examples from Jessica Jones and The Handmaid's Tale, noting that in Jessica Jones, we're never shown the titular character in any titillating outfits, and we're presented with the lasting trauma of her sexual assault, but never the sexual assault itself. Similarly, The Handmaid's Tale frames Offred's sexual assault from her perspective. The panning of the act itself is blurry, mirroring Offred's disassociation from what is happening to her. Now, I'm no film critic, but I personally find that what Forster says resonates with me. Several of the articles I read in writing the script also mentioned French film Portrait of a Lady on Fire as an exemplary example of the female gaze. Portrait is about a young noble woman, Héloïse, and a painter, Marianne, hired to secretly paint her, as Héloïse has refused to pose for portraits. Over the course of the film, the two become involved in a relationship. As noted in an article by Gwendolyn Smith about the female gaze, the film manages to capture their red-hot desire without requiring, say, the controversial full-frontal sex scene that takes up an outsized portion of Blue is the Warmest Color, Abdelatif Kashish's 2013 film about a tempestuous lesbian romance. In focusing on the emotional buildup rather than the sex itself, Siama eroticizes the characters' feelings rather than her actors' bodies. So taking all of this back to our subject at hand, the Final Fantasy VII Remake, assuming that the female gaze exists, is it present in the FF7 Remake? And I would say that the answer is yes. I don't think it's as prominent as the male gaze visually, but one spot in particular comes to mind. At this point, I should probably note that I'll have minor spoilers for the FF7 Remake in this part of the video, but I will be delving into major spoilers for the FF7 Remake in the next parts, as well as spoilers for the original Final Fantasy VII game and for Crisis Core. Consider this your official spoiler warning. In the middle of the game, and if you haven't played the game, I think I'm just going to give you this information without any context because it's much funnier this way. Cloud is talked into performing a dance with a nightclub owner named Andrea to impress him. They have not rehearsed this dance in any way, but Cloud manages to stumble through it regardless of how well you do, or in my case, do not, perform the controls.
Well, you tried.
Cloud's reward for all of this is to be dressed up as a fancy woman. As a member of my chat said while I was playing this section of the game, there is no straight reason for any of this. I think there are a few important things to note here. First, during the scene, the camera occasionally lingers on their bodies, but it is mostly focused on the chemistry, the emotional buildup between Cloud and Andrea. And second, the viewer of this scene is explicitly Aerith. We cut to Aerith excitedly cheering Cloud and Andrea on several times during their dance. As Cloud is being dressed, we see Aerith looking on with anticipation, and we are also treated to her look of awe when she takes in the finished product. Andrea tops the whole scene off with this line. True beauty is an expression of the heart, a thing without shame, to which notions of gender don't apply. Don't ever be afraid, Cloud. However, there is another factor in play here when it comes to gaze in the Final Fantasy VII Remake that I think is particularly interesting. The male gaze or the female gaze is about how the subjects of the work are shown or described, yes, but as I've discussed, it's not just about the work's visuals or description. It's also about how the work is structured and specifically from whose perspective it is structured. As Laura Mulvey notes, a male protagonist in a story operating under the male gaze can make things happen and control events better than the subject/spectator. He is a figure in a landscape. The male protagonist is free to command the stage, a stage of spatial illusion in which he articulates the look and creates the space. But here's the thing. In the FF7 Remake, Cloud is our main character. He's the default character in battle, and except for a few areas, he's the character we control when walking around cities or the 500 slums and ruins in this game. He's attractive, well-built, masculine, he even wields a sword as large as he is. But unlike the ideal male character that Mulvey describes, for most of the game, Cloud does not control events. In fact, in many ways, Cloud barely has any agency in the plot of the game at all. Part 2. Agency. Sociologist Nikki Lisa Cole defines agency as the thoughts and actions taken by people that express their individual power. Agency is the power people have to think for themselves and act in ways that shape their experiences and life trajectories. Cloud doesn't do this. At least for most of the game, Cloud doesn't do this. In order to show just how much Cloud doesn't do this, let me go through the plot of the game. Cloud begins the game as a mercenary assisting members of Avalanche, an eco-terrorist group concerned about the way that the Shinra Electric Power Company has been harvesting Mako, a magical energy substance, from the world. Together they bomb a Mako reactor. The Mako reactor explosion is much larger than any of them expect, which puzzles the members of Avalanche, but they decide to move on with their missions. It turns out that Cloud decided to help this Avalanche cell at the behest of his childhood friend Tifa, who also can't pay him quite yet but promises to do so soon and does manage to get him an apartment for free. So far so good. But after this follows a series of decisions that other people essentially make for Cloud and he just doesn't say no to. Let's go through those, shall we? Tifa tells Cloud that they should do a bunch of jobs around the community that will pay him in experience and reputation, even if they probably won't pay much in actual money. Keep in mind that Tifa still has not paid my boy his fee yet for helping Avalanche. Jessie, one of the members of Avalanche that Cloud had assisted, tells Cloud that he should come with her to get a new blasting agent from a Shinra warehouse. This involves Jessie telling Cloud to sneak in the back door for Family's house to steal her dad's Shinra ID card while Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge eat pizza with Jessie's mother to distract her. It's worth noting that Jessie's dad is comatose from Mako poisoning and just lying there while Cloud does this? No, this is not weird and uncomfortable at all, Jessie. Aerith tells Cloud that she's hiring him to be her bodyguard, even though when they return to her house, she reveals that she was never planning on actually paying him. She was intending to compensate him by helping him gain experience and reputation in this new section of the slums, which again means that Cloud is roped into helping members of her community for mostly free. To quote a member of my chat, "Your affection is not legal tender, Aerith." Aerith tells Cloud to pick a bunch of flowers to give to an orphanage. Then she negs his choice in flowers. Let's get some cattails. I think those will go nice with the lilies.
Foxtails, huh? I gotta hand it to you. I never
sorry,
would have thought of
foxtails.
that. It'll definitely take them by surprise.
That last bit isn't relevant to my point here, but I'm still bitter about this. Aerith tells Cloud that he should stay the night at her house before reuniting with Tifa and company the next day. Aerith's mother tells Cloud that he's dangerous for Aerith and that he should sneak out in the middle of the night. After Cloud sneaks out in the middle of the night in what is genuinely the world's worst stealth mission. What?
What are you doing?
Nothing.
Did you have a bad dream? Don't worry, you'll feel much better in the morning, and I promise to take you straight home.
This is amazing, I love it. Seriously? How light of a sleeper is Aerith? I barely made any noise.
Now get back in there.
Okay.
Okay. The bucket's out of the way. Why are there so many stools? Why did they block off the upstairs? Okay. Whatever. Nope. Back up. Aerith somehow catches up to Cloud and tells him that she's going with him. Aerith and Cloud catch a sight of Tifa in Wall Market as she's heading to the house of Don Corneo, the local criminal lord. Aerith insists that they have to help Tifa. Part of this involves Cloud getting a weirdly sexual hand massage that leaves him very disoriented. Part of this involves Cloud being roped into gladiator combat for, you guessed it, reputation and experience. Part of this involves Aerith insisting that Cloud dress up as a woman, even though he is clearly uncomfortable with the plan. From among Tifa, Aerith, and pretty Princess Cloud, Don Corneo decides that Cloud is going to be his new wife, and Tifa and Aerith have to run in and save Cloud before Don Corneo tries anything. After finding out from Don Corneo that Shinra plans on destroying part of the slums, they race to get back in time to warn Avalanche. When they come across a train graveyard, Cloud admits that he is afraid of ghosts. Tifa and Aerith laugh off his concerns and drag him along, even though they are then repeatedly attacked by ghosts in the train graveyard. Okay, admittedly, Tifa also seems less than thrilled to be there, but Aerith does act like Cloud's fear of ghosts is silly when it is 1000% rational in this case. The group is unable to stop Shinra from destroying the Sector 7 slums, but Tifa and Barrett insist that they have to return to Sector 7 to see the extent of the damage. They end up going into a secret underground laboratory to rescue Wedge, during which Cloud disappears for a long time, and the only person who was concerned about this was me, myself. Again, this last bit probably isn't relevant, but I'm still bitter on Cloud's behalf. In sum, for I'd say about 2/3 of the game, the plot is not something that Cloud actively participates in bringing about. Instead, the plot happens to Cloud, and he just goes along with it. In reviewing the major beats of the story during these first 2/3 of the game, there are only a few places I identified where Cloud actively makes decisions that impact the plot. First, when Cloud is hired to help Avalanche destroy a second Mako reactor, as at least there, the situation is framed more as, we know you want the money, so we're hiring you, but there seems to be a level of potential opt-out, as opposed to the way that Tifa, Aerith, and Jessie framed their various adventures with Cloud as more of a, hey, I'm telling you to do this thing, so just go along with it, and Cloud just goes along with it. Second, when Cloud decides to help Avalanche fight against Shinra to keep them unsuccessfully from destroying the Sector 7 slums. And finally, when Cloud asks Aerith's mother for permission to attempt to rescue Aerith after Aerith is taken captive by Shinra. In a lot of ways, Cloud feels like the way that well-intentioned creators often write quote-unquote strong female characters, or should I say miswrite strong female characters. There are a number of writers who don't seem to understand that a strong female character isn't just physically strong and doesn't even have to be physically strong. Instead, a strong female character has independent thoughts and goals and the agency that allows her to drive the story forward. It's not enough to give a female character sarcasm and the ability to punch real good if she has no real interaction with the plot. In Agent Carter, Peggy Carter isn't a great character because she knows how to throw a good left hook. She's a great character because she has a rich inner life and makes important decisions that drive the story forward. But here, sarcasm and the ability to punch real good basically describes Cloud. He's a physically strong man that mostly just goes along with what other people tell him to do for most of the story, even when he's visibly uncomfortable with it. It's clear at several points that Cloud is less than pleased with the fact that he's basically working for free.
I've got to ask, though. What did you tell them?
He is extremely uncomfortable with the plan of being dressed up as a woman.
Not a word.
Not even one?
No!
But you're so pretty!
He also expresses genuine discomfort with going into the train graveyard.
Ghosts aren't my thing.
And yet at every step of the way, Cloud is pulled along regardless. So, if Cloud doesn't have the agency in the game, who does? And interestingly enough, the answer is mostly the female characters, at least on the side of the protagonists. Barrett makes some decisions with respect to Avalanche, but Jessie and Tifa also play a huge part in making Avalanche's plans. Jessie is the one responsible for building the bombs for the Mako reactors, and Biggs and Wedge mostly defer to her. In the wall market part of the game, Cloud does a whole lot of work at the command of Madam M, including fighting in gladiator combat where she pockets all of his earnings like a #girl boss. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Tifa and Aerith discuss Shinra's plans to destroy the Sector 7 slums and whether they are bluffing, with Cloud only providing minimal input. And speaking of Aerith, well, Aerith is an interesting case. In a lot of ways, Aerith fits the manic pixie dream girl trope to a T. Coined by critic Nathan Rabin in his review of Elizabethtown, he defined a manic pixie dream girl as a woman who exists solely in the fevered imaginations of sensitive writer-directors to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and its infinite mysteries and adventures. As a later article from the staff of AV Club put it, "Ah, the manic pixie dream girl, that sentient ray of sunshine sent from heaven to warm the heart and readjust the attitude of even the broodiest, most uptight male protagonist." And yes, that largely describes the relationship between Aerith and Cloud. But the term manic pixie dream girl has fallen out of favor in recent years, partially because of inherent issues with the term, and partially because of the way it has been applied. In an article entitled, "I'm sorry for coining the phrase manic pixie dream girl," Rabin notes that he made up the phrase because in thinking about Kirsten Dunst's character in Elizabethtown and Natalie Portman's character in Garden State, he identified an archetype that taps into a particular male fantasy. of being saved from depression and ennui by a fantasy woman who sweeps in like a glittery breeze to save you from yourself, then disappears once her work is done. The problem with this definition, though, is that it is inherently sexist, as it presumes that a manic pixie dream girl has no internal life apart from the man she is saving from himself. Thus, viewing real-life women as manic pixie dream girls is also inherently misogynist, and it can also be reductive when applied to fictional characters. And I think it's probably reductive when applied to Aerith. Sure, she is a ray of sunshine, and we don't see a great deal of her inner struggles, but that is partially because Aerith doesn't like letting other people see her suffer. And Aerith's world doesn't revolve around Cloud. She has a complicated backstory, and in fact her quick attachment to Cloud is explainable by that backstory, which I'll get into in a minute. Aerith is clearly an important and beloved member of her community. She quickly strikes up a weirdly flirty friendship with Tifa. She volunteers to go into the Sector 7 slums and save Barrett's daughter. And so even though the byproduct of many of her decisions involving Cloud are that she warms the heart and readjusts the attitude of my skinny child, I don't necessarily think you can dismiss her actions as being attributable to manic pixie dream girl status. I think it would be unfair to ignore the fact that even though Aerith is captured by Shinra and a good chunk of the plot revolves around saving her, Aerith, I'm so sorry you were kept in a cage while I wasted so much time doing pull-up competitions. She does have quite a bit of agency in the story, perhaps even more than Cloud does. But I want to circle back to a point I made earlier. For most of the story, Cloud almost fundamentally lacks the ability to say no when people tell him to do things, especially when those people are women. This is probably at least partially because the game developers wanted to give the player the illusion of having choice as a way to mask the fact that the FF7 Remake is largely a linear game. Sure, there are a few open-world areas you can explore, but the times when you can explore them are extremely limited, and the environments are all pretty much some version of slums. Literally. Yet, there's a thought that I can't get out of my head. Something that I don't know was a fully intentional decision on the part of the developers, but which I think is true nonetheless. Part 3. Coping with Trauma. After the first Mako reactor explodes, Cloud hallucinates Sephiroth, a figure from his past whom he thought that he had killed. The thought that Sephiroth might be alive terrifies Cloud, and he continues to have these hallucinations on and off throughout the game. In certain situations, Cloud also seems to have episodes of painful flashbacks, and possibly even episodes of disassociation, such as when Aerith mentions that Cloud reminds her of her first love, who like Cloud was also a soldier with all capital letters, or when Cloud visits laboratories in which human experiments were performed. Cloud's past is not explained in the FF7 Remake, because the story hasn't gotten that far yet, but it is expounded on in the original Final Fantasy VII game and in the prequel game Crisis Core. Cloud was a lonely kid who grew up in Nibelheim, the same town as Tifa, and had a massive crush on her. He decides to leave the town and join Soldier partially to impress her. The Soldier program produces Shinra's most elite, soldiers, the most prominent of whom even have their own fan clubs as part of Shinra's propaganda efforts. However, Cloud is not accepted into Soldier and instead becomes a regular Shinra grunt infantryman. He meets Zack Fair, an actual Shinra soldier. Wow, calling the Soldier program Soldier was not confusing at all, especially when trying to narrate things. Thanks, Square Enix! When Cloud is assigned to work with Zack. The two bond over being country boys from small towns where the only notable feature is a Mako reactor. Later, Cloud is again assigned with Zack and with Sephiroth, another soldier with all capital letters, to investigate monsters and the Mako reactor at Nibelheim. At Nibelheim, Sephiroth learns that he is the product of experimentation with Mako and cells from Genova, an extraterrestrial life form whose remains are possessed by Shinra. Sephiroth suffers a mental breakdown, burning the village down and killing most of the villagers, including Cloud's mother, and injuring Tifa. Zack fights Sephiroth at the Mako reactor but is unable to stop him. Cloud, however, manages to sneak up behind Sephiroth and stab him with Zack's Buster Sword, but the blow does not kill him. Cloud then attempts to fight Sephiroth but is easily overpowered, and Sephiroth stabs him with his legendary Masamune sword. However, Cloud rallies his strength and throws both Sephiroth and the sword into the planet's life stream below the Mako reactor, which appears to kill Sephiroth. Both grievously injured from their encounters with Sephiroth, Cloud and Zack are taken by Shinra forces and delivered to Professor Hojo, who proceeds to experiment on the two of them over the course of 4 years using Mako and Genova's cells. Zack manages to escape from the experimentation lab, taking Cloud along with him. Being a former soldier, all capital letters instead of a soldier, all lowercase letters, Zack is much more resistant to the experimentation, but Cloud becomes sick with Mako poisoning and mostly catatonic. Zack tries to take both himself and Cloud to Midgar, where he knows that his girlfriend Aerith is, but he is stopped by a Shinra army. Zack hides Cloud and faces the army by himself, but even with his superhuman abilities, he is overpowered by the sheer numbers of them and mortally wounded. Cloud wakes up and, at least in Crisis Core, watches his friend die. As he's slipping away, Zack gives Cloud the Buster Sword and tells him to carry on his legacy, which unfortunately Cloud's mind takes quite literally. Between the 4 years of experimentation, watching his hometown be destroyed by Sephiroth, and his best friend die in front of him, Cloud has a breakdown, and he comes to believe that he essentially is Zack. He still remembers Tifa and his childhood in Nibelheim, but he thinks that he was the soldier first class who fought alongside Sephiroth for Shinra. All of that brings us to Cloud as he is at the beginning of both the original Final Fantasy VII and the FF7 Remake. To put it mildly, Cloud is clearly suffering from a lot of trauma, and you don't need to know about his whole backstory to pick up on that. Yes, some of Cloud's hallucinations are probably due to the fact that he has a weird mental bond with Sephiroth, now that he also shares some of Genova's genetic material, and others are visions of alternative timelines, but that's not true for all of them. Cloud frequently disassociates when he's around Aerith, for example. He can't even process her saying Zack's name. And the jump in severity of his episodes when he's in the lab he was experimented on is significant. I'm not a doctor, but let's just consult the symptoms of PTSD for a moment. Recurrent unwanted distressing memories of the traumatic event. Reliving the traumatic event as if it were happening again. Severe emotional distress or physical reactions to something that reminds you of the traumatic event. Being easily startled or frightened. Always being on guard for danger. Huh? Do these symptoms remind you of anyone? But what's interesting is that many of the symptoms of PTSD aren't nearly as transparent. In her article, Broken Boundaries, Invaded Territories, The Challenges of Containment in Trauma Work, psychotherapist Morit Heitzler writes, "Trauma almost by definition breaches people's normal boundaries. It is as if life was driving a bulldozer over people's normal sense of protection, sense of safety, and sense of self. This has a significant impact not just during the traumatic event itself, but also carries lasting effects on the psychological organization of traumatized people. Those who suffer from developmental trauma and complex PTSD carry lifelong relational scars, as the people whom they were meant to trust and rely on most have been the very ones who have invaded and abused them. This creates such a confusing, chaotic model of relating that the only way to somehow manage the presence of others is by controlling, manipulating, and keeping them at bay. In this case, boundaries are either non-existent or rigidly maintained, but their main function is to avoid any possibility of real intimacy in which two people can attempt a close, trusting, and respectful connection." In a post entitled Boundaries and PTSD, Why You Need Them, How to Set Them, Elizabeth Bryko discusses her own experiences as a trauma survivor. Boundaries also take on heightened significance for people with PTSD because they challenge the negative assumptions trauma survivors often form about themselves. For me, a physical and sexual abuse survivor, my early recovery was marked by feeling like I didn't deserve to be respected or valued. My desires and personal space were violated so often and for so long that I began to believe that reality was my status quo. Even now, 10 years after the end of my abusive relationship, I catch myself sometimes allowing other people to dictate my experiences based on their desires instead of my own. In short, many people who have experienced trauma have real difficulty in setting and maintaining healthy personal boundaries with other people. And frankly, I think you see this with Cloud. I joked throughout my play of the FF7 Remake that Cloud will do anything a woman tells him to do, but in all genuine seriousness, Cloud really, really struggles to tell people no. You see this in the fact that Cloud begrudgingly complies with Tifa and Aerith's request to drag him around town and basically just find people's cats for free. No, this is not an exaggeration. You see this in the way that Cloud goes along with being dressed as a woman. You even see this in how when Don Corneo chooses Cloud to be his new wife, Cloud just kind of sits there as Corneo harasses him. Cloud only acts when Corneo is literally about to pounce on him. It's framed as a humorous scene, though Don Corneo creeps me out too much for me to be actually amused. Mostly, I find it deeply sad. These responses by Cloud may have been at least partially written and programmed as a way to ensure that Cloud is pulled along with the plot, but they also fit very well with someone who is trying to put himself back together after life-altering trauma. Cloud is withdrawn, rarely appears to be happy, and seems to have genuine difficulty in making decisions for himself. And let me explain why I think this matters. I'm about to give some minor to major spoilers for a whole bunch of media that should be listed on screen right now, so please be aware of that. I am also going to discuss instances of traumatic events in fiction, including sexual assault, physical violence, and emotional abuse, and I will further be citing some studies on domestic violence and suicidal ideation. If any of those are topics you would like to stay away from, here's a timestamp for you to skip ahead to. Additionally, to be completely upfront about the limitations of what I'm about to say, I use a lot of gendered language in this section, and I know that some of my viewers do not identify with a binary definition of gender. I want to acknowledge you and the limits of viewing gender as a binary instead of a spectrum, but unfortunately there is so little mainstream media that deals with non-binary and gender-fluid folks that discussing trends and how media traditionally portray people who do not fit into a male-female binary is next to impossible for me to do. Further, there is simply a lack of scholarship in this area, both as it relates to what I am about to say and to my previous discussion of the male gaze. Again, I recognize these are limitations on this video, and I would honestly appreciate any thoughts you may have about these topics if you want to leave those for me in the comments, which I do actually read. I should also note that in the upcoming discussion, I'm going to use examples of mostly visual media. There is plenty of written media that also follows the patterns I'm about to discuss, particularly in certain genres like science fiction and fantasy, but there are also genres where these patterns are less applicable, such as young adult fiction or romance, which are often doing their own thing. Okay, so, media is full of stories about men's trauma. Just to name a few off the top of my head, Joel from The Last of Us is coping with living in a brutal world that took the life of his daughter. James Bond in Quantum of Solace is dealing with the death of his lover in the previous movie. In Season 1 of Arrow, Oliver Queen is struggling with his life after returning from an uninhabited island on which he was marooned and then brutalized because it turns out the island wasn't so uninhabited after all. However, while media include numerous stories of male trauma, they are usually stories of a specific kind of male trauma, and a specific kind of response to that trauma. Men in media are often traumatized because of physical brutality, sometimes inflicted onto them, but frequently inflicted on another person, and bonus points if that person is a woman. Outside of war movies, it's relatively uncommon to find a story of a man who's traumatized because of violations to his person. In particular, stories of male sexual assault are incredibly rare, as are stories where the trauma is focused on emotional rather than physical abuse. Now, I'm clearly speaking in generalizations here. I don't want people to litter my comments with examples of stories that violate these rules. I know these exceptions exist, but that doesn't change the fact that they are exceptions rather than the rule. Additionally, stories focusing on male trauma often show that trauma manifesting in the man becoming aggressive, angry, and violent. One could even say that they manifest in traditionally masculine traits. And that isn't to say that these are unrealistic responses to trauma. People with PTSD are often irritable, detached, prone to outbursts, and vulnerable to self-destructive behavior, all of which are common responses we see in men who have experienced lasting trauma in stories. But these are far from the only responses people may have to trauma. Other reactions include hopelessness, memory problems, trouble concentrating, guilt or shame, and a feeling of emotional numbness. Rather than showing these symptoms, male trauma is often, for lack of a better term, loud. By contrast, female trauma is often quiet. In stories, women are much more likely than men to experience trauma as a result of abuse, whether that be physical, emotional, or sexual. Stories of trauma because of violations to a woman's personhood are everywhere, and women are much less likely to be shown reacting to this trauma through violence or aggression. If you want a good example, just look at Disney movies. Snow White and Cinderella grow up with emotionally abusive step-parents, and they react by being sweet, kind, and loving. Elsa in Frozen has a whole lot of baggage from the way she was raised, and that results in her concealing and suppressing many uncomfortable feelings about herself and her abilities. She is also ostracized by society when she becomes inadvertently aggressive. And speaking of which, if women do react in quote-unquote loud ways, they are often painted, to use a very gender-charged term, as hysterical, as emotionally compromised. And yes, I understand that part of the reason that stories about men experiencing trauma and stories about women experiencing trauma are set up in these ways is because on some level they echo problems in society. Men are much more likely to commit violent crimes. Women are more likely to be victims of domestic abuse and sexual assault. But there's a problem that arises when only certain types of stories are predominantly told. At what point do we stop reflecting the problems of society and start perpetuating them? For example, yes, most victims of sexual assault are female, but men can and do experience sexual assault, and men are much less likely to report an assault than women are. Is the lack of stories in media about men struggling with sexual assault a reflection of how women are much more often victimized? Or is it actually a reflection of how uncomfortable we as a society are with the concept of men being assaulted? How the assault reporting systems in place, which are already hostile to women, are in many ways even more hostile to men. And all of this fits into our understanding of the male gaze. To better illustrate all of what I mean, let me give you a few examples. In the spaghetti western Once Upon a Time in the West, Jill McBain is a former prostitute who moves to a piece of land near a fictional town called Flagstone to meet up with her new husband, only to find out that he and his whole family have been murdered. They were killed by a hired gun named Frank, who is trying to gain ownership of that piece of land, and now that the land belongs to Jill, her life is in danger. To keep Frank from murdering her, Jill eventually, to put it lightly, allows him to seduce her. He does spare her life, though he later forces her to sell her land at gunpoint. Jill eventually emerges victorious through the intervention of a group of bandits, but the movie never really explores the effects that dealing with Frank have on Jill. I think the film's stance is essentially that Jill is a former sex worker, so sleeping with Frank isn't a big deal to her, and it's possible that it is not. However, even taking into account the fact that being a sex worker in the 1800s was often a coercive profession, I still kind of think there is a difference between sleeping with someone because it's your job and sleeping with someone because they are literally going to murder you if you do not, and might murder you anyways. Jill also plays a passive role in the film's resolution. I'm not exaggerating in what I'm about to say. Her job is literally to take a bath so that one of her allies, a man known as Harmonica, has a high point by which he can spot men with guns. And yes, I think there's absolutely something to be said for the fact that Jill is a survivor who uses her beauty and femininity as a weapon to persuade the men around her to do things that she would never be able to do by herself. But none of that changes the fact that Jill's trauma is largely unexplored, and she plays a limited role in a story in which she is ostensibly one of the main actors. By contrast, it is shown very early in the film that Harmonica has an unresolved grudge against Frank, and it is revealed that this is because Frank murdered his older brother when Harmonica was what looks to be a teenager. And at the end of the film, Harmonica kills Frank in revenge. The film plays squarely into the gendered ways that male and female trauma are often depicted. The source of Harmonica's trauma is physical and from acts committed against someone else, from the murder of someone he cared about. He is allowed to respond with violence and masculinity. The source of Jill's trauma is largely emotional and yet also based on acts committed against herself. It's the upending of her new life when she finds her new husband and stepchildren murdered, as well as the threat of death throughout the film's story, and the sexual assault committed against her person. She, by contrast, is allowed to respond only with internalized anger and femininity. Jill, in short, is far more object than person with agency. This is the male gaze in action, and frankly, the film could not be more blatant about it.
If I was you, I'd go down there and give those boys a drink. can't imagine how happy it makes a man to see a woman like you. Just to look at her. And if one of them should pat you behind, just make believe it's nothing. They earned it.
Or how about the story of Macbeth? At the urging of his wife, Macbeth reluctantly murders his king and maneuvers his way into succeeding him. However, over time, the guilt causes Macbeth to become more and more hardened, eventually committing atrocity after atrocity as he becomes detached from humanity. By contrast, Lady Macbeth, the woman who told her husband that she would kill the king herself if she were a man, is driven insane by the guilt and eventually commits suicide. The story starts with the Macbeths as a generally gender-defying couple, with Macbeth shown as the sensitive one and Lady Macbeth as the cold, calculating one. And yet, by the end, their roles have flipped. Macbeth is one of my favorite of Shakespeare's plays, partially because watching how guilt warps the Macbeths in unexpected ways is genuinely fascinating. But that also doesn't alter the fact that those changes in the Macbeths fit squarely into gender norms. Or if you want another example of this, just look at the Star Wars prequels. Anakin believes that Padme is going to die in childbirth, and he responds to this by allying himself with the bad guy he spent about a decade fighting against, killing a bunch of children, and then also attempting to strangle his wife. And Padme responds to Anakin's betrayal by just losing the will to live until she dies. As one does. Man, this is taking me back to the class on the Brontes that I took in college, where we could not figure out why people kept getting seriously ill from being minorly stressed out. I think this is part of the reason that Good for Her movies are having a moment right now. If you're unaware, a Good for Her film is broadly defined as a movie in which the female protagonist ends up on top, and often these movies involve stories of women committing acts of violence or revenge. It's a vaguely defined genre, if you can even call it that, and I've seen people disagree on whether a movie like Midsommar can be considered a Good for Her film, for example. I also have my own personal issues with the fact that a lot of these Good for Her movies involve violence, because I don't know that the way to counter the presence of so many stories centered on male violence is to create an equal and opposite reaction of female violence. I don't think Newton's third law was intended to apply to film. But I also get it. These are stories that don't often get told, and the anger and aggression depicted in many of these Good for Her movies is cathartic for women who exist in a society that portrays these responses in women as wrong. It's like, I have an issue with the fact that the film Promising Young Woman has been frequently lauded as the female version of Joker over the past year. I recognize that both Joker and Promising Young Woman are revenge stories, and in both movies the protagonists have a legitimate reason to be upset. Arthur Fleck is poor and lonely and has a disability. Cassie Thomas is still struggling with her best friend's assault and subsequent suicide. But Arthur takes out his feelings using violence. Moreover, while his acts of violence end up setting off waves of protests and riots due to socioeconomic disparity in Gotham, this was an accidental byproduct of Arthur's actions. By his own admission, the violence was the end unto itself. But for Cassie, while her acts of revenge can be cruel, she performs them to challenge the structures in place that facilitate gendered violence, to highlight how even seemingly nice men and women hypocritically participate in a status quo that is often actively destructive to women. Also, Cassie doesn't kill anyone. She doesn't come close to killing anyone. That's kind of a big difference in my book. Like Arthur, man, I realize that Wall Street bros are terrible, but you can't just murder someone for being terrible. Now, I mentioned earlier that I think these are trends in media about how men and women experience and deal with trauma, and as trends, they aren't going to be universally applicable to every situation. However, even given this, I do want to add a few caveats for the sake of getting ahead of the comments section in case this video ends up being, I don't know, a spicier take than I was intending. The first is that, as you can probably tell from the examples I've shown and described, I've based these trends primarily on mainstream media produced in the United States. Mostly because, living in the United States, that's the main media I consume. Given that the only thing the United States exports more than petroleum oil— but petroleum oil, really? I knew we'd been producing more oil recently because of the Dakotas, but that's our number one export? Then what are we doing still screwing around in the Middle East? Given that the only thing the United States exports more than petroleum oil apparently is our culture, that means that mainstream media in the United States is often also mainstream media globally. That being said, it would be nothing less than hubris if I did not acknowledge that the media from the United States does not represent the culture and values of everyone everywhere. Based on my experiences with more indie media and media from countries with names that don't sound like a football club in the UK, along with the fact that I know things like gender-based violence are far from a US-only issue, I do think that these trends I've identified are probably fairly universal. Still, whether they ring true for you and the media you consume will likely also depend on where you live and your local culture. My second caveat is that intersectionality can absolutely come into play here and complicate whether a character's trauma response in fiction is probably gendered. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example. In Black Panther, Killmonger's father was killed by his uncle when he was a child, leaving him abandoned in 1990s Los Angeles. He grew up in that environment and then spent a good amount of time in the military, which is essentially a trauma factory. These scenarios fit pretty squarely with the types of trauma I've identified as occurring to men in fiction. Then, during the course of the movie, Killmonger kills and manipulates to gain access to the fictional country of Wakanda, fights his way into becoming king, and attempts to ship Wakandan military equipment to their operatives worldwide so they can start global revolutions. In essence, Killmonger reacts to trauma with violence. Also check. However, to say that Killmonger's actions are simply him reacting as a man to trauma with violence is reductive and ignores context, specifically the history of African Americans in the United States. Even though Killmonger is Wakandan, the US is where he grew up. Let's roll some B tape, shall we? That is, let's roll some Michael B. Jordan tape. I know it's not actually funny, but what you have to understand is I've been working on this video for months now. Between that and the pandemic, I have 2 brain cells left.
You know where I'm from. When black folks started revolutions, they never had the firepower or the resources to fight their oppressors. Where was Wakanda? You know, that ends today. We got spies embedded in every nation on Earth, already in place. I know how colonizers think, so we're gonna use their own strategy against them. We're gonna send vibranium weapons out to our war dogs. They'll arm oppressed people all over the world, so they can finally rise up and kill those in power, and their children, and anyone else who takes their side.
It's time they know the truth about us. We're warriors. The world's gonna start over, and this time we're on top.
The sun will never set on the Wakandan Empire.
There is far more context than I can cover here, especially given that this is somewhat of a tangent to my main point anyways, but let me touch on one relevant one. If you're not from the US, you may not realize that during the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, there was a very real group called the Black Panther Party founded to oppose police brutality against African Americans. Black Panthers were known for openly carrying weapons while they monitored police officers at work. However, as the party expanded and gained support, the Black Panthers began offering community social programs, including free breakfast programs, sponsorships for schools and legal aid, health clinics, sickle cell anemia testing centers, and more. In the late 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, decided that the Black Panther Party was a quote-unquote black nationalist hate group and decided to include the Black Panthers as one of the targets of COINTELPRO, a surveillance and covert action program carried out by the FBI. No, this is not a conspiracy theory. This has been confirmed by some documents burgled from the FBI in the 70s and other documents voluntarily released by the FBI later, though we still don't know the full extent of the COINTELPRO program. The FBI attempted to discredit and undermine the Black Panthers, spreading dissidence within the party itself and between the Black Panthers and other organizations. For example, the FBI sent a letter to the leader of the Blackstone Rangers, a Chicago gang, informing him that the Black Panthers had put a hit out on him. This wasn't true, but they hoped that the Blackstone Rangers would retaliate against the Black Panthers in response. The FBI also sabotaged the Black Panthers' social programs, including raiding pantries to shut down their popular free breakfast program. The FBI even planned and carried out the assassination of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton. This last event is the subject of the acclaimed movie Judas and the Black Messiah that came out earlier this year. So when Killmonger is suggesting that Wakandans arm oppressed people, which presumably includes African Americans in the United States, it's in this context, along with hundreds of other ways that African Americans have been targeted by federal, state, and local governments. It's a context of African Americans being victims of violence for daring to advocate for fairer treatment and equal rights, both with shows of force, as the Black Panthers used, and without shows of force. To this latter point, it's worth noting that COINTELPRO focused on a number of figures in the civil rights movement besides the Black Panther Party, including Martin Luther King Jr. Ultimately, a story and a character can be more than one thing. Killmonger can be reacting to trauma in a traditionally gendered way, and also in a way that is probably the result of the dumb country he grew up in. Now, whether he's justified in suggesting this course of action is a completely different story. I'd recommend watching this video by LaRon Reedus if you want more discussion of why Killmonger is still on shaky moral ground with his plan. As it turns out, the answer to colonialism is probably not an equal and opposite reaction of colonialism. I do not think Newton's third law was intended to apply to colonialism. Also, maybe don't kill your girlfriend when she becomes inconvenient. It's hard to have the high ground when you murder people. Still, I think all of this makes Killmonger probably the most sympathetic of the Marvel villains next to Wanda in WandaVision. Is that a hot take? I don't even know anymore. Granted, being a good villain in the Marvel universe isn't hard. What do you want, Dark Elf Doctor? Why are you evil? Is it for the memes? Are there even any memes of Thor the Dark World? Is that what you want, Elf Doctor? You want me to make you a meme? My final caveat here is that I do think the gendered ways that men and women experience and react to trauma in fiction holds up less for queer characters. For one, the trauma that queer characters experience in fiction is often related to their queerness, so my note about intersectionality is back in play here. However, and possibly more importantly, this seems to be connected to the fact that queerness defies heterosexual gender norms, and fiction grapples with this in ways that are often perplexing, to say the least. For example, in his book Genders and Sexualities in Indonesian Cinema, Ben Murtaugh includes a section about how lesbians were portrayed in film up through the 1990s. Critics have noted the relative invisibility of lesbians in mainstream cinema, with the exception of two genres: pornography, aimed at the heterosexual male, and horror. Indeed, a notable body of writing exists which looks precisely at Hollywood's creation of deadly, deranged, predatory lesbians, spawning a number of epithets, such as lethal women, the deadly doll, lesbians who bite, and the lesbian vampire. Commenting mainly on American film production, Kelly Kessler notes that there was a boom in movies depicting lesbians in the 1990s, and that while those films directed by women often presented images of lesbian love, male directors were more likely to continue the tradition of focusing on lesbians as deviant threats to the social order. Media has made some strides in depicting LGBTQ+ characters since the 1990s, but the shadows of these kinds of portrayals of queer characters still remain, along with the fact that, as I alluded to in the beginning of this section, queer characters, especially certain types of queer characters, can be rare to non-existent. Some of this can be blamed on the Hays Code set by the Motion Picture Producers and Distribution Association in the United States in 1930, which banned depictions of homosexuality in film. As a result, for a long time in American cinema, characters could not be explicitly gay if the movie was going to get, financing, backing, and distribution. Moreover, if a character was implied to be gay, that meant the character had to be punished in some way by the story. This led to a number of villainous or tragic characters being queer-coded, as well as the invention of stock gay characters intended to be taken less seriously. As Kwon Kim notes in the paper Queer-Coded Villains and Why You Should Care, the first example of the stereotypical gay-coded character was the sissy. The sissy made everyone feel manlier or womanlier by occupying the space in between. He didn't seem to have a sexuality, so Hollywood allowed him to thrive. These stock sissy characters would be used for humor in old films, usually flamboyant and obnoxious to a ridiculous extent through dress and behavior.
Hey, wait a minute. He can't go in there.
Oh, that's all right. Believe me, fellas, it's all right.
If you want to know more about queer coding and queer baiting in cinema, I would recommend watching this video by Rowan Ellis because a full discussion is beyond the scope of this video essay. My point is rather that queer characters are often depicted differently when it comes to gendered expectations of how characters typically behave, and fictional trauma is no exception. But if the male gaze inherently means that we have plenty of stories directed to loud male trauma and quiet female trauma, and the Good for Her genre is starting to bring stories of loud female trauma to the forefront, then what about stories of quiet male trauma? What about stories where men are not victims of violence committed against others, but of violence committed against themselves? What of men who have faced abuse, and not just physical abuse, but emotional or sexual abuse? What of men who have experienced violations to their very personhood, men who were victimized through actions they did not consent to? What about stories where men do not display coping mechanisms in line with traditionally masculine tendencies? What if instead of becoming angry or aggressive, they become withdrawn and compliant? And the truth is, those are kind of hard to find, and they're even harder to find done well. In Iron Man 3, for example, Tony Stark exhibits a number of symptoms synonymous with PTSD because he nearly died at the end of the first Avengers movie. Those symptoms include trouble sleeping, withdrawal, panic attacks, and flashbacks. In writing this script, I read several articles praising the movie for including this aspect of his character's internal conflict in Iron Man 3, and I don't disagree. But ultimately, this is a Marvel movie, and Tony Stark can't simply, work through his conflicts by going to therapy. I mean, he could. They definitely could have done that, but you can't punch therapy in the face, so they didn't. No, his PTSD symptoms basically just disappear after he has a panic attack and the child he's working with suggests that he build something to cope with the panic. The YouTube channel Cinema Therapy made a video on Tony Stark that I think has some interesting insights on this film, and as they put it...
So, I think the obvious question there is that remotely realistic to, come out of a full-blown panic attack because you just remembered a thing?
Yeah, or somebody said just the right thing.
Just the right thing? Is that... I mean, I assume that has happened before, but is it common?
In the history of the world, I'm sure it's happened. It is not common.
Right.
What I do like about the scene realistically in terms of... So Iron Man 3 does a great job of portraying what PTSD and the anxiety attacks look like. Now, at this point in the story, we just kind of need Tony to go in and kick ass and be Iron Man, so his PTSD is just kind of done. But in real life, that's not how that works. Happens. Yeah.
And as someone who has panic attacks sometimes, and pretty mild panic attacks at that, to the point that I usually don't have too much trouble calming myself down, even I have to say, lol, no. Ultimately, Tony Stark's PTSD is never referenced again. It never appears in any of the subsequent Marvel movies. It doesn't look like he ever seeks help for it. In some ways, it's almost like the film is saying, "Hey, Tony, have you tried not having PTSD?" And Tony is responding, "Oh man, you're right! I never thought of that!" It turns out the real treatment for PTSD was inside of us all along. Since we've talked a bit about men who have been experimented on, let's look at one of the more famous examples of that trope. Our good friend Wolverine. Wolverine is a fantastic character, he really is, but he is rarely portrayed as having anything less than a baseline of aggression. Great job stabbing your child there, bud. Yes, you definitely don't need therapy, just push your past deep down inside and stab something that is not a child, and I'm sure you'll be fine. Or how about we look at Wolverine's experimented on spiritual cousin Deadpool? Ah yes, Wade. You seem to be coping well and definitely without any of that typical male aggression I've been talking about. No therapy needed here either. One of the best examples I could come up with of quieter male trauma where the trauma isn't just whisked away by the man punching something real good is Geralt from the Witcher series. And pick your poison, books, TV show, video games, my large muscular child has the same basic problems wherever you find him. Geralt struggles with the fact that he was the subject of genetic experiments as a child that made him a Witcher with superhuman abilities, yes, but which were also grueling, painful, and killed most of the children that underwent them. He also grapples with the fact that as a Witcher, he can never be more than a fringe member of society because common people fear his abilities and associate Witchers with the monsters they were created to kill. It's weirdly kind of the same reason that society hates lawyers. Plus, as a professional monster hunter, he has seen some things. Unlike many of the examples I've talked about, the main source of Geralt's trauma is the way that his personhood has been violated, both by the abuse that he received as a child and by the fact that most people in his world don't even consider him to be human. There's even a myth that Witchers don't have feelings, and it's heartbreaking to see that thrown in Geralt's face time and again when he is clearly going through some stuff. But Geralt largely buries all of these feelings deep down inside of him. See, it's just what I was saying, push up past deep down inside and stab something and everything is fine. This is a joke, just in case that wasn't clear. Please do not start stabbing things instead of going to therapy. You see, Geralt is a crusty boy, but he typically isn't violent or overly aggressive to other people without a good reason to be so. Moreover, while Geralt spends a lot of time hunting monsters, Geralt's personal struggles are not resolved by killing things. Instead, a large part of Geralt's story is him finding meaning in life through connections that he builds with other people, particularly with his adopted daughter Ciri. I think the same basic sentiments could be applied to Joel from The Last of Us. Joel is gruff and detached as a result of living in a really terrible world and watching his daughter die in his arms. But again, while killing is inherently something he has to do to survive, it's not something he enjoys, and it's definitely not something that helps to erase his trauma. It's Joel's relationship with Ellie that starts to bring him more happiness and meaning. Action Button Reviews has a great segment in his review of The Last of Us that discusses the ways in which the game mechanics show Joel opening up to and trusting Ellie over time. He also calls the mechanic of having a secondary character that the player must protect but who also levels up over the course of the game a baby child, big friend situation. And that's not relevant here, but I do love it. And yet, in both of these situations, Geralt and Joel still largely react to their trauma in ways that are traditionally masculine. Their trauma may be mostly internalized rather than making them lash out at others in violence, but they are also gruff, abrasive. They have no problems with putting down boundaries. In fact, if anything, their boundaries are too thick. They struggle to let people into their lives. This is absolutely another way that trouble with boundaries as a result of trauma can manifest, but it's also what we come to expect of men. Men are stoic, enduring, strong in the face of traumatic experiences. And in Joel's case, once again, we see that the main source of his trauma is not from what was done to him, but from what was done to someone important to him, and bonus points because that person was a girl. At its core, I think that a lot of the difference between the ways that traditional stories about male trauma survivors and female trauma survivors manifest comes down to vulnerability. Women are allowed to be, probably even encouraged to be vulnerable in the face of trauma. Moreover, their trauma often arises because of acts committed against them when they were vulnerable. But men are not supposed to be vulnerable. And that's genuinely a problem. In a paper entitled Gender Matters Working with Adult Male Survivors of Trauma, Jimena E. Mejia writes, "The main assumption supporting social definition of masculinity is perhaps the most basic. Men are synonymous with masculinity, and masculinity is somehow an intrinsic property of maleness. When we as a society free ourselves of this assumption, we can see masculinity as a kind of ideology, a set of powerfully held beliefs. Masculinity is an ideology that is exalted to the status of gender identity. Men are forced, oftentimes traumatically, but not always so, to internalize the ideology until they experience it as an intrinsic part of their being. Indeed, often the very core of their personal identity. Because the essential features of masculine ideology are toughness, fearlessness, and the denial of vulnerability, it is not surprising that individual men and society as a whole have been slow to acknowledge that men can indeed be victimized, and that, like all victims, they can suffer. Our culture's blindness to the suffering of male survivors of trauma can be understood as the result of clashing schemata. The schema of men as essentially synonymous with masculinity is still well entrenched. It is therefore very difficult for people to be cognizant of the contradictory view of men as tough and invulnerable on the one hand, and hurt and suffering on the other. Many individual men have experienced the clash of these schemata. More than once, male survivors of sexual assault have reported that they were turned away by rape crisis centers. The worst example is a male victim who was told that a crisis center did not have the staff to treat perpetrators. It never entered the staff member's mind that the caller was not a perpetrator, but rather a victim of sexual violence. These observations are even more poignant when you remember that there is a link between PTSD and suicidal ideation. For example, one study of veterans found that between all veterans interviewed, 18.5% were found to have thoughts of suicidal ideation over the past week, but for veterans with PTSD and/or depression, the number was 24.1%. Another study with a much larger sample size found that 6% of active duty members in the United States reported past year suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, but for service members with PTSD, the number was a full 3 times larger at 18%. Additionally, the study found that 90% of service members with PTSD had comorbid depression. And the fact that men may be reticent to seek help or be unable to find help in response to suffering trauma because of socialized masculinity doesn't just matter for them. It can also have a very real impact on the people they are close to. In particular, trauma survivors with PTSD have relatively high rates of domestic violence. For example, one study of nearly 300 men who had committed intimate partner violence and checked into a domestic violence center in Maryland found that while only 11% of the men fit the criteria for PTSD, this was still 3 times the rate of PTSD for men in the United States. Additionally, men with higher levels of PTSD symptoms also had worse relationships and higher levels of abusive behaviors on all of the scales that were measured, which included physical assault, sexual coercion, and emotional abuse. A study of 853 police officers in Florida found that 28.6% reported committing domestic violence, which is just so much. But officers were 4 times more likely to commit domestic violence if they had PTSD. Further, while I couldn't find any research on this point, it worries me that the media we consume socializes us to accept that it's normal that men who have experienced trauma become aggressive, when those same aggressive tendencies can lead to domestic abuse. Now, I don't mean to suggest that it's wrong that men can become aggressive when they experience trauma. Goodness knows you can't really control the coping mechanisms your brain will come up with when you've been through a traumatic experience. It's more that I worry about the ways that aggressive, traumatized men are considered normal, which in turn may make it socially harder for them both to realize and accept that they need treatment and to find the treatment that they need when they do. I want to go back to Mejia's paper on treating male victims of trauma. In her conclusion, she states the following: male survivors of trauma are best conceptualized as experiencing 2 interacting traumas. They have been socialized, often traumatically, into an ideology of masculinity that in many cases has severely limited the resources with which they live their lives. In addition, they've had a traumatic experience that, while leaving its own legacy, also tends to massively complicate the legacy of their masculine socialization. At the core of most traumatic experiences are overwhelming states of fear, helplessness, and vulnerability. These states are extremely difficult for anyone to deal with, but they carry an added message and burden for male trauma victims. Virtually all men feel to some degree that they do not measure up to the standards of masculine ideology, because the standards literally defy men's basic humanity. You guys, I realize that the Final Fantasy VII Remake is a silly game about a bizarro steampunk world featuring a cast of characters that includes a sentient lion whose design reminds me way too much of Nuka from The Lion King 2. But It is also a game about a man who is experiencing trauma in a different way from how media usually shows male trauma, especially in video games. Cloud's trauma is quiet. It causes him to have flashbacks and periods of disassociation. It erases his boundaries. It takes away his ability to act on his own behalf, making him a passive participant in the story unfolding around him. Cloud can sometimes be abrasive, but it's less in the ways that Geralt or Joel are abrasive. Rather, he seems to struggle with the basics of forming a human connection, with understanding how to socialize himself in the world beyond Shinra. And that last one isn't entirely a result of his trauma. Cloud is genuinely a shy, awkward, introverted person, a fact that quickly caused me to imprint on him like a baby duckling. Cloud and I are very different people, but as a fellow introvert with social anxiety who consistently rolls ones when asked to do a small talk check, I relate so hard to so many of his interactions.
We just gotta find that bathroom so we can get into the air duct. Ask anyone here. They can point us in the right direction.
No thanks. We can find it on our own.
I'm in this conversation, and I don't like it. I haven't latched onto a character this hard since... oh gosh. Why do I keep imprinting on these men? Is being inexorably drawn to sad boys going to be the feature that finally ties my channel together? But Cloud's struggles with interpersonal relationships also seem to be exacerbated by his trauma. Moreover, yes, Cloud's trauma is partially because of grief from the deaths of people he cared about, but a very large portion of his struggles are a result of the ways in which he as a person was violated through Hojo's experimentations. Cloud is traumatized because of a time that he was vulnerable, and the ways in which his coping mechanisms manifest often belie that vulnerability. Whether intentional or not, this very popular game features a masculine character who is suffering from trauma in ways that are not traditionally masculine, in ways that could even be called, well, feminine. And that freaking matters. I also don't want to entirely discredit the developers here, because I think at least some of this was intentional on their part. In an interview, co-directors Motomu Toriyama and Naoki Hamaguchi and battle director Teruki Endo were asked about a number of aspects of the remake, including how the voice acting and facial expressions in the remake changed how the characters could be portrayed. In response, Toriyama stated, "Compared to the original, we were able to depict the nuance that comes with facial expression alone, and thanks to our incredibly talented voice actors, I think we were able to increase the depth and realness of the characters. One bit that sticks out is when Tifa visits Cloud at night in the Sector 7 slums. The scene is full of emotion. When talking to friends, the old Cloud comes out, so he treats Tifa more kindly, the music builds up, and their feelings are conveyed better." They also note the importance of the human experimentation through line to the story. Hamaguchi stated that they had to make some changes to lines regarding human experimentation to get past the ratings check, with Toriyama adding, "But if we change the fact that soldiers are a result of human experimenting done by Shinra, then the game stops being FF7, so we really push for that to stay unchanged." Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think that Cloud is single-handedly going to change the way that society views male trauma. Most people playing the game probably won't even think about these things on a conscious level. I realize that I'm the insane person who compulsively analyzes basically all of the media I consume. Except the Godzilla movies. I don't think about those. Eyes wide open, head empty there. But culture often affects us in intangible ways. And the more times we see characters like Cloud, characters that subtly show us that there is more than one kind of trauma, and more than one way to react to trauma, the better for everyone. And on top of the way that Cloud experiences trauma, there's the way that he deals with that trauma. Unfortunately, the game does not include a Cloud sees a therapist side mission, which would be my ideal way of seeing Cloud cope with his trauma. For some reason, therapists seem to be non-existent in Midgard, and basically all of fantasy, despite them being desperately needed. Darkest Dungeon. Sending your characters to self-flagellate does not count as giving them psychiatric help! Pulling from the concept of agency that I discussed earlier, there are basically two levels of conflict going on in the plot. On a surface level, we have the external conflict with Shinra and Avalanche over the Mako reactors. This is a conflict that Cloud participates in, yes, but as I've discussed, makes very few active decisions about. However, on a second level, we also have the internal conflict going on within Cloud. The conflict where he is working on how to be a person again after everything he has experienced. If you follow me on Twitter or have watched any of my streams of the FF7 remake, you probably know that I have been joking since nearly the beginning of the game that the Final Fantasy VII Remake is secretly a dating sim. I actually made a whole presentation about it. I've been joking that the Final Fantasy VII Remake is secretly a dating sim because there are a lot of people in Cloud's life that are kind of into him. As such, who is considered a potential waifu in the FF7 Remake has been something I've spent a lot of time analyzing and debating. That is not a sentence that I thought I would be uttering when I started playing the game, but it does make for a great joke. It's also not a joke. I mean, the Final Fantasy VII Remake being a literal dating sim is a joke, but the connections that Cloud builds with the people I have identified as waifus are not. Ostensibly, the FF7 Remake is about that external plot regarding Shinra, but really, it's about Cloud making friends. The emotional core of this game is entirely about Cloud's inner life and struggles. For example, take some of the few decisions that you as the player are actually allowed to make in the game. Does Cloud accept the flower from Aerith? Does Cloud accept a drink from Tifa? Does Cloud accept Jesse's offer to make him a pizza? Cloud has a lot of women in his life who want to give him things. There is a reason I keep joking that this game is a dating sim. None of these decisions actually matters, and no matter what you decide, events ultimately pan out in mostly the same ways. But I think it's notable that these rare player decision options all relate to Cloud's relationships to other people. Over the course of the game, you watch as Cloud slowly starts opening up to the people around him. If you remember back to the previous section, I said that in the first 2/3 of the game, there are only a few places where Cloud seems to actively make decisions that engage with the external plot. And those decision points all occur because of Cloud's relationships. Cloud mainly accepts the second job to help Avalanche because he's worried about Tifa. He decides to fight the Shinra goons trying to destroy Sector 7 less because he's worried about Sector 7 and more because he's worried about his friends already fighting the Shinra goons. And he decides to infiltrate Shinra because of Aerith, whom you know Cloud feels strongly about because she's one of the few people Cloud truly opens up to and talks to at any length over the course of the game. In fact, it's this last decision that ultimately serves as a turning point for Cloud in the story. After Cloud makes the decision to go back for Aerith, his relationship with the external plot shifts. He starts taking charge, coming up with plans. He keeps Barrett on track when Barrett wants to deviate from the mission to find Aerith. He voluntarily tells his friends to save themselves when they're cornered by Shinra forces, saying that he'll hold them off himself. When Tifa asks Cloud if he'll help her rebuild her bar, he even jokes that he'll only do it for a price, and honestly, the fact that he did not just grunt out an assent to a thing a woman asked him to do shows progress. Also, I know it's a joke, but get that coin, boy! I'm really invested in Cloud getting paid. And the importance of friends isn't just something that matters in a Final Fantasy game. Having these kinds of connections and a support network is genuinely part of coping with this sort of trauma. Ultimately, the external plot here doesn't matter as much as the internal plot, compared to Cloud getting to know the waifus. Believe me, if the external plot was paramount here, we wouldn't have so many sections of the game that are just about getting sidetracked. I thought that I was never going to leave that train graveyard. I was all on board with making friends with ghosts, but no. No more. I hate ghosts now. They're all terrible. Not a single good enemy is a ghost. Those sidetracked sections are only significant when you consider that what really matters here is not beating Shinra, but the friends we made along the way, and the way those friends help Cloud feel like a person again. I think it's also significant that eventually the internal and external plots in a way converge when Cloud again meets what appears to be the real Sephiroth. This isn't an Iron Man 3 situation where he punches an unrelated bad guy and all of his psychological problems go away. Sephiroth is both directly and indirectly a large source of Cloud's trauma, And the fact that Cloud not only chooses to face him head on, but chooses to face him alongside his friends is meaningful, especially when you consider Cloud's terrified reaction to Sephiroth when he hallucinates him alone in an alleyway for the first time at the beginning of the game. Cloud doesn't even hesitate to go after Sephiroth when Sephiroth creates a literal break in reality. I mean this honestly, sarcasm aside, Cloud taking the lead when he spent most of the game doing whatever he was told, him charging after Sephiroth to protect a city of people that at the game's beginning he struggled to show visible concern for, him fighting alongside his friends to defy a destiny imposed on them by forces that should have been beyond their control. I felt emotional at the ending. I realized that defying fate and defeating evil through the power of friendship is a very anime ending, but not all anime pull it off well. The payoff only works here because we have actually seen how far Cloud has emotionally come since we started the game. I think you could even see the ending as a sort of allegory of Cloud's internal struggles. The whispers that Cloud encounters in the space between realities are a manifestation of the future trying to ensure that events stay the same. Cloud fights against this so-called destiny in the same way that he has learned to fight against the demons created in his own mind by the ways in which other people have tried to control him and his life. With the help of his friends. And they win. If you define feminism as the desire for equality of all sexes, which I do, the weird thing is that despite how male-gazy this game can be, there is an element to it that is strongly feminist. The external world-changing plot is often controlled by women who have their own internal conflicts and relationships. They have the sort of power traditionally relegated to men. And yet, the most important facet of the plot is the emotional life of its main character and his bonds with other people, the sort of story traditionally relegated to women. This game gives Cloud the freedom to be vulnerable, and it's about how love and friendship work to heal trauma that manifests in unexpected ways, and how they can help us relearn to take control of our own narrative. In a world that often feels isolating and terrifying and bleak, that's the kind of story that really speaks to me right now. Thank you for watching this video. As I said, I realize that I tend to analyze the media I consume to an insane degree. It's your blessing and my curse, I suppose, but it's nice to know that someone consumed the thoughts that were consuming me as I played this game. The articles that I reference in this video should either be in the description or linked in a reference document in the description, along with any YouTube videos that I clipped in making this video essay. At the least, if you want to know more about Crisis Core, I'd recommend the video My Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Journey by Lee XP. I really enjoyed it, and watching her sob at the conclusion of the game made me feel a whole lot better about getting emotional while writing this essay. If you want to see me go to more insane lengths in analyzing video games and other pieces of media, you know what buttons you need to press. Just Also be warned that I have been known to make fan songs and audiobooks of my own fan fiction, and when I do weird crap like that, people often unsubscribe, so just keep that in mind before you click the big red button. If you would like to follow me on Twitch, where I typically stream whatever game I'm working through at the moment, you can find me at PlayheadNorth. You can also find me on Twitter under the same handle, but let's not kid ourselves. Don't follow me on Twitter. It's a Doomiverse. You don't want that. You don't want to be there. I don't want to be there either, but it's too late for me. Save yourselves! Follow me on Twitch. I'm even more unhinged there when I'm streaming than I am on this channel, if you can believe that. And if you're a Final Fantasy VII Remake developer, I want to take this opportunity to quickly give you some targeted feedback. I enjoyed your game, but as I mentioned, it would have been even better had Cloud been able to purchase and wear a cowboy hat in Wall Market. I was also disappointed by the number of street vendors selling food in Wall Market that sounded delicious, but I couldn't buy. I really think being able to buy street vendor food would significantly help my FF7 experience. The same goes for the Starbucks in the Shinra building. There was a whole display case with pastries and pies. I couldn't purchase any of them, and I'm still bitter. Along the same lines, I was really looking forward to eating a pizza with Jesse, so I would appreciate the option to eat a pizza at some point. Yes, a lot of my concerns are food related. Oh, and my dudes, what was up with not letting me stream the last few chapters of the game? Do you really think that people with capture cards aren't streaming the ending? Weird move, people. Weird move. Okay, back to the game. Additionally, I would like a pet chocobo and the opportunity to name my pet chocobo Fred. And also, have you considered making the next installment include a formal dating sim? Because I have a presentation prepared already. I think it would really bring a great new element to the game. Just look how popular Fire Emblem became when it amped up its relationship mechanic to allow you to formally find a waifu. Email me if you want to talk more. As for the rest of you non-FF7 devs, I know it's a tall order, but stay sane out there. And please, don't write me an essay in the comments about how I should really be making a video essay about Crisis Core and Zack Fair, who, with his ability to respond to injustice and cruelty with compassion and forgiveness, is the sort of hero we don't deserve, but is the sort of hero we need right now. I already know, okay? But nice capture cards are expensive, and that would require me to get my brother to dig up his copy of the game so that I can actually play it, and I already have so many partially written scripts I need to finish first. I don't. Okay, don't tempt me, okay? Don't tempt me! Don't do it. Don't. Bad. I know you're writing it. You need to stop. You need to stop because I don't have time for this. I don't have time to play Crisis Core and to write another video essay and okay, I just need, hopefully I'm gonna get through this essay and my brain will stop thinking about Final Fantasy VII the way that doing all of that for Pathologic made me stop thinking about Pathologic. It was very cathartic. I need to stop thinking about this game. I need to stop. I'm going to be consumed by my sad boy media.